So as long as it's fair, as long as it's voluntary, inequality is fine. Inequality is great. We want those who succeed to be more rewarded than those who destroy value. But in the sense of our current environment, we have really sinister inequality.
If everybody, if the water's flowing and everyone is benefiting, right? Everyone's cup is filled. People are happy, right? They have better things to do than to line up outside of someone's house and threaten to chop their head off.
I don't think we should be setting up guillotines anywhere, and that's why I love Bitcoin. It's the peaceful revolution, right? But why do people want to set up these guillotines? Because they know the system isn't working. It's not working for them, and despite working very hard at many jobs and climbing the ladders, it's still the prospects for retirement, even the ability to afford a home today is just it's outside of the reach of so many very hardworking Americans. The system is not serving them. The system stratifies wealth through asset inflation and in disproportionate access to assets.
Welcome to the Tucson Blockchain Podcast, and today I have on Dr. Chris Dark from the Dr. Dark After Dark podcast. You may have also seen him on Twitter. He is a pretty incredible guy and had some really awesome takes on the world and where things are going. We talked about a wide range of topics from Bitcoin to the macro environment, and I felt like I learned a lot from him. Best part though is that he actually has a pretty hopeful outlook on the future, and I thought that was a breath of fresh air. So I hope you enjoy. Alrighty, welcome to the podcast, Chris. Dr. Chris Dark has an awesome podcast called Dr. Dark After Dark, and I would encourage you to check it out. I found the podcast after he had a fed up biz owner who was also on mine, and I've just been really enjoying it. And we were initially going to discuss energy as the new world reserve currency, but we both felt that it'd probably be more important to talk about the current events just because there's so much going on right now. And I think you have a pretty interesting take on it coming from Hong Kong. So, welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Great to be here.
So what do you foresee over the next month happening?
Not chaos yet. That's probably after November the 3rd. But a lot of choppiness in markets, probably a lot of volatility. So, volatility can rise when you've got, if you're going against the trend. So if you think about in March this year, stocks are being up and up and up, and then they went down really quickly, and you had a big spike in volatility. But volatility can also rise if you're just whipsawing up and down in a range, which could well be what's going to happen now. I mean, we've just had sort of the world's fastest recovery from COVID, and who knows if Trump's fully recovered or not. Probably not, but no one could get straight answers out of anyone about his health. And we saw the markets dumping on Friday, coming back on Monday, and everything was timed for when futures were closing and opening. And it just seems that the next month's just going to be more of this madness all the time. And the next kind of if you remember this time last year, it was all about the China trade deal. That was kind of the thing that everyone kept talking about, and it was driving a lot of people nuts on Twitter because everyone knew it was not going to be a big thing anyway. Even if they did buy everything, it was pretty small in terms of the grand scheme of things, but markets cared about it. And then the new thing now is, of course, the kind of second major kind of stimulus package, which may or may not happen before the election, and may or may not happen after the election, depending on what happens. So whilst I know not everyone likes talking about politics, and again, I might say things that offend some people, but I honestly don't care who wins the election. I'm not American. I don't vote. I don't know who I'd vote for if I was in America. Politics in Europe, where I'm from originally, are very different, very, very different. So, I think the next month's going to be, just volatility. And in some ways, I just hope one of the two wins by a mile. And then, we don't have to have all the craziness in November and December. So that's a lot of the stuff that FedUp's talked about many times. So,
Yeah, he was talking about how probably the best way to avoid violence is just for there to be a landslide election, and I'm kind of hoping for that too, because I don't want to see American cities burned down. But yeah, it is interesting. It seems like a lot of foreigners are pretty outside of the United States are pretty in tune with American politics because it has such a big impact on monetary policy across the world, and that's been what I've been hearing a lot from a lot of macro people right now. So yeah.
But on that, like, America matters more than every country in the world put together when it comes to this stuff. I mean, I'm British. I live in Hong Kong. You know, I spent a lot of time in China, and China, you know, is obviously the second biggest economy. But even, you know, but it still doesn't have the impact in many ways. Like, and maybe it's similar now to what Japan did in the 80s, in terms of being the second biggest. But the US is, the reason people care about US politics is it matters. Honestly, it doesn't really matter if Boris Johnson wins, loses in the global stage. It absolutely matters in the UK and maybe Europe. People in Asia don't care. Most people in the US don't care. But US does matter. So, you know, and again, so people from the outside, like I'm looking outside in, I'm looking at all the different data sources, which may or may not be right. We don't know. But yeah, it's people care because it matters. So America's, whatever you think of America, it's still the most important country when it comes to economics.
Yeah, it's as far as the data being hard to decipher, I've had somebody come on the podcast talking about how the inflation metrics are incorrect, and he had a pretty compelling argument for it, having compiled his own inflation calculator. And then I'm also talking with somebody right now who compiles their own national debt information, and which is completely different than what is presented.
I assume theirs is a little bigger. So
it's not 27 trillion. It's
we hit 27 yesterday, didn't we? So apparently, but a zero in the end.
It's like 137 trillion, I think, is what she said. But yeah, why do you think American politics impact the rest of the world so much?
Well, I mean, okay, so why don't we think about I mean, at the end of the day, the thing that matters, if you knew one thing in macro every day, it was if you could know one piece of data every day, it's not, is the S&P going up or down? You'd need to know, is the US dollar going up or down? If you knew that every day, you would print infinite money, not by trading, even if you didn't trade currencies, because so much is correlated. You know, so traditionally, you know, commodities would have a negative correlation with the dollar. Why? Because they're priced in dollars. Generally, the stock market does. Generally, bonds correlate with the dollar. Not always. And so, you know, gold tends to correlate negatively with the dollar, but didn't in 2019. So the point is the US dollar matters gigantically. And again, whether or not we're getting towards the end of its reign, which we might be, and like you said, you know, we think about talking about energy as the next reserve currency. I mean, I don't think that the next reserve currency will be a fiat currency. I mean, if it's not the dollar, it can't be anything else. I mean, unless there's some weird basket, but really it's going to confuse people. I mean, you're going to have weight the basket by GDP? I have no idea, but it doesn't seem that simple. And there's no other fiat currency that can touch it. So that's why it matters. It's really the dollar. And anyone that isn't, it's really hard to have, sometimes currency can be really difficult. So it's not so hard sometimes if it's emerging markets versus US dollar. That can be, you know, very long, kind of relatively simple trends. But right now, in terms of dollar versus the major currencies, it's just chopping around, and no one has a clue which way it's going to go. Mm-hmm. There are very smart people that think it's going to rocket up, and very smart people that think it's going to crash down. Mm-hmm. Although most of them, in the long run, think it's going down. I don't know anyone that thinks in a 10-year plus scenario, and you've got to think in long term here, like that it's going to be fiat's going to be super strong, because governments seem hell bent on destroying the value of paper currency, you know, which is in effect good for people investing in harder currencies, whether it be, well, I'm going to say Bitcoin's a commodity because it isn't a currency yet. You can't use it it doesn't fulfill the three things of a currency, I can't go and spend it in Starbucks. But equally, I can't do that with gold either. But property and all sorts of other kind of hard assets, whether it be art or wine or limited edition cards or anything that's like unique. So basically, things that are scarce, I think, are going to be very interesting in the next kind of 10 years to own.
Yeah, I was talking to my mentor who's in the real estate business here in Tucson, and he's been talking about how hot it's been because housing is something that's scarce, and so it has value. And people are kind of rushing to those scarce assets to preserve their wealth because I think everybody's kind of in tune with that. You can't just print trillions of dollars without it eventually devaluing. And yeah, I mean, trying to figure out what's happening right now, it'll definitely make your head spin because you're right. People who are very smart are saying very opposite things. And
yeah, but a lot of it's just due to the timing. Okay, so for example, if we take, so I know like Brent Johnson pretty well. I don't know Luke Groman, but I've listened to a lot of his stuff, and they obviously have very different views on US dollar. But actually, it's a different short-term view to medium-term view. In the long run, they both agree that it's probably going to be going down. And Brent thinks it will spike before it does because of dollar shortage in the world, just like happened in March. In effect, we get a second dip in the global economy, which is perfectly plausible. It could happen. I mean, if governments weren't doing all this stimulus right now, and probably none more is possible in Europe, that's probably done for now. They only just agreed the last one, and it was pretty touch and go at some points. And so you could easily have a classic double dip like we had in the or US had in the early 80s, which is again, and that actually used to be very common, having double dips. But it's interesting though because all hard assets have pros and cons. So I did a podcast before on hard assets. It was called Framework for the 2020s, and it was all about hard assets. And my point in it was you want to think about liquidity. So if you ask people when was the first gold ETF, unless people know when it was, they're probably going to guess gold ETFs have been around for decades. It's not true. They've been around since about 2003. Wow. Which is that was when it took a long time to be approved. So by the way, people thinking Bitcoin ETF tomorrow, like, and I know that's been the meme, like for I held Bitcoin for many years. I get the memes, and like it's gonna come, but it could be 5-10 years away. The gold bugs wanted this in the 80s, the 90s. Like it took time, and it's a perfectly good proxy. But what happened as soon as the ETF came in 2003, the gold price started rocketing, and it wasn't due to that. Wasn't because of 2007, 2008. That hadn't happened yet, and so you had this really good run in gold around then. And the point is that my point is the more liquid an asset is, the better it's going to be. But it's got to be liquid. So you could say, well, Bitcoin's very liquid, sure, but it's not liquid if you're trading accounts on Fidelity or Schwab, because the only way, as of right now, you can then get access to Bitcoin is by buying futures, and you might not be allowed to trade futures. So, there isn't just a simple ETF, and most people are still not registered on whatever Coinbase or whatever it might be. So property has always been relatively illiquid because it takes time. Having said that, and it doesn't need things to necessarily be tokenized, but the securitization of property is starting to happen much more. That will give more liquidity. But the downside of property is it can be taxed very easily. You can't move your land. So, I mean, I think anyone that's thinking, I think there's one thing fairly certain in the next 10, 20 years is that at some point, governments are going to have to start raising taxes in a fairly big way to try and pay off the debt. Or maybe they just don't care and try and inflate it away. But in effect, that's kind of like a tax anyway. But property is very easy to tax. So you can, there's all sorts of taxes you can put on it. But just like, gold was in effect illegal to own in the 30s in the US, the same might happen to something like a Bitcoin, but then other countries won't do it. And, there's pros and cons to everything. So my point to people is always, why put all eggs in one basket? Like, for a start, it's going to be more volatile. And if you spread the risk a bit and you can kind of rebalance between it, it's generally a better way in the long run.
Sure. Yeah. I'm pretty excited. There's been some pretty crazy headlines around Bitcoin this year that will provide more liquidity through different services like PayPal and Venmo potentially offering Bitcoin buys, because Cash App's been doing it for a while and they've been very, very successful.
Great job, yeah. And they're making real money on it. Right? I mean, actually, it's significantly helping their business.
Yeah.
And you think PayPal's not looking at that and going, I need a piece of that? Of course they are. But also, I think the most important thing, which went a little under the radar, but not really. I mean, in Bitcoin, in crypto Twitter, people were talking about it, but when the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in the US, who had recently joined from Coinbase, he was the chief legal officer at Coinbase before. So they're one of the many regulators of US banks, and they allowed, basically said US banks will be allowed to custody Bitcoin on behalf of clients. And this, for those in the kind of banking sector, this is a little bit like having kind of a enabling kind of prime brokerage and stuff like that for Bitcoin. And so whilst you've had people like Fidelity and other big names kind of really, because Abigail Johnson, the CEO, she's like been very pro Bitcoin and blockchain for a long time. They've kind of got ahead of the curve, but now the regulatory hurdles are kind of being moved out of the way. And I think that, and for instance, one of the memes in Bitcoin for years has been, basically when are the institutions going to be buying? And well, you know what? They just want to, I'd run a venture capital firm before and dealt with many, they're called limited partners, LPs, which are pension funds, high net worths, people like that. And pension funds want to be using the tools they know. They're not going to go and make an account on Coinbase, because if something goes wrong, the guy doing it gets fired. And they don't want to get fired. Family offices can be different. They can absolutely, if the family like something, they can absolutely go into something earlier. And that started to happen a few years ago with Bitcoin. But it's still got tiny adoption, right, in terms of, but so's gold. I mean, gold's about 0.5% of, if you look at institutional assets. And its long-term average has been more like 3 or 4%. And Bitcoin is going to be like 0.0 whatever percent. So in terms of asymmetric trades right now, Bitcoin is, for me, asymmetric trades in an asset that's still many hundreds of billions in size. It seems to be the kind of obvious one right now. But it could still go down to 5,000, right? I mean, anyone that says it can't is, well, they're frankly lying. Of course it could. I think we're probably past the point where it can go to zero. But upside, there is no limit. I mean, 100,000, a million. There's just, yeah. Yeah. As we were talking about before, like, gold bugs and Bitcoiners, for some stupid reason, love to like sort of hate each other. And I mean, the biggest meme of all is Peter Schiff with this, right? He's a very smart guy, super smart guy. He sells gold though, and so that's what you got to remember: is always know what someone's biases are. He sells precious metals. That's his main business, and products surrounding that. So of course he's going to come out in favor of gold. But the arguments of gold bugs, Bitcoiners, whatever, 95% of the arguments are identical when it comes to fiat money. The fact that politicians are not going to stop themselves printing money. What do you think they're going to, right now, are they going to raise taxes or are they going to print more money? Well, 99.9 out of 100 politicians are going to do the latter. And that's the same everywhere in the world. It's no different anywhere. So that just means that whilst fiat currencies might, which is going to go up and down between US dollar and euro, honestly, no one knows. But if they're just all being basically inflated, money supplies, well, and this is where the nuance comes in, right? Like you can print trillions of dollars, and a lot of it doesn't actually enter the money supply because banks have to lend in order to do that. So there are a lot of subtleties here too, but some of it does leach out for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Peter Schiff is honestly a great marketer. I would have never heard of him had he not been trashing Bitcoin. So I think it's a good way to capture a younger audience for sure. But
it's great. I turn off his podcast though when you get. So those who listen to his podcast, it's roughly 50 minutes to an hour, right? And exactly 41 minutes in, he always says, "Oh, I've forgotten to talk about Bitcoin," like every time. And then I just turn it off because there's no point. And sometimes you might want to turn it on, just fast forward 5, 10, however long he's going to go on about it. But the first 40 minutes of his podcast are often literally just 100% agreement with what a lot of Bitcoiners say. It's just they disagree. It's a bit, the way I think of it is like, we're all on broadband, right? And you know what? There's what's called the last mile, which is the connection. In the UK, it's called last mile. In the US, it's probably last 100 miles. But it's the connection from the exchange, and then originally was a copper wire, and now could be more fiber optic, right, to your house. And that last mile was it's basically the bit that Bitcoiners and gold bugs disagree on. But everything from the exchange backwards, they agree. All the infrastructure, all the kind of meat of the argument, they agree 100%. But look, I own both in pretty much equal amounts. So I mean, about 25% allocated to both. And I always like to say what I'm invested in, because it means people can work out what my biases are.
Sure. Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, I am super biased against Bitcoin because I'm almost all in on it. I had a pretty fair equity position leading into COVID, and as soon as the bounce came in, I got out real quick because I was expecting that double bounce, and or dead cat bounce is what I like to call it. But
right, but if you put it into Bitcoin, let's say, so I've just been avoiding equities pretty much for most of this year. But Bitcoin has been correlating. So if you look at the low Bitcoin and the NASDAQ, right? So let's give a bit more juice by using the NASDAQ, because it's gone up more than the S&P, right? I mean, Bitcoin went down to say 4,000. It's now at roughly 11, so it's almost done 3x. Well, the NASDAQ hasn't even doubled. So actually, Bitcoin's way outperformed. So whilst some people are like, oh, I've got to be in stocks. Well, why? I mean, there's no law that says you have to be. By the way, in the long run, you probably do because of dividends and compounding and the Warren Buffett angle, right? Sure. But in times like now where there's a lot of uncertainty, I mean, Bitcoin outperforms stocks for sure since the dip in March. But it's been correlating very highly with NASDAQ recently. Now, it's had times in its life where it's correlated very highly with gold. It's had times where it's correlated with absolutely nothing, and it's just been kind of pretty much random, which is why it's such an interesting asset, because it actually doesn't really correlate. But right now, it's very much sort of a risk-on correlation, but that will change at some point. So that's why I think it's so interesting, because it's kind of my proxy to equities right now. But at the same time, I know there's only over 21 million. So if the fiat gets out of control, like completely out of control, like as in 10 trillion stimulus, 50 trillion stimulus, I mean, this is possible, right? Especially if there's a Democrat, the last 2 weeks have said it's more likely to have a Democratic sweep. And again, whether you love or hate Trump, I'm just saying what the numbers say. And then you're going to get stimulus checks, and the amount of the packages, I mean, there'll be double figure trillions very quickly. They'll probably do some good infrastructure stuff, which the US desperately needs. Driving on US roads and, the train tracks and stuff, it's kind of embarrassing compared to Europe and Asia. And it seems to be the one thing both parties have agreed on for years, but they've never done anything about it. So probably because politicians always have their pet projects. But yeah, I mean, if you think of the election now, I was just looking back at the numbers from, I looked at October the 5th, 4 years ago. So Clinton was 4.5% ahead right now in the national polls, which of course are not that important, just based on how, and I'm talking about the presidential race. So, and Biden's 7.3 right now. Okay, so he's a few percent ahead by Clinton was. But what people forget is Clinton had a surge during the second and third debate. And she peaked at the third debate, which was like the 18th of October. And of course, we have no idea if there's going to be a second or third debate or whatever. And she peaked with like a 7% lead. And then she rapidly plunged after that. And on election day, she was 3% up. And actually, she won the popular vote by, I think, 2.1%. So really, the polls were not very far off at all. In fact, I think Nate Silver said they were the most accurate they've been in a long time, except some of the swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and stuff like that. Kind of, Trump won Michigan by 10,000 votes. Florida was tight as always. So a lot could still happen. Biden's further ahead, and he seems to have momentum right now. But maybe we've had the October surprise with the fastest recovery from COVID ever. But there's still 4 weeks to go. But it just, I think the Senate's much more interesting race. That's much tighter. So, and in some ways, in every way is important, because the difference between the Democrat sweep and if Republicans keep the Senate is like night and day in terms of what can be passed. So, but again, we don't know if Trump loses, let's say the presidency, but they keep the Senate. And I mean, the House is almost certainly the House is much more along the lines of national vote, just the way it works. I mean, there's almost no scenario where Republicans win the House. I guess it's possible, but incredibly unlikely. I mean, I guess there'll just have to be a massive polling error, like gigantically. No one knows what, and this is where again there's uncertainty. So no one really knows how Republicans would in the Senate would react in that situation. Are they going to say begrudgingly pass a small stimulus, or are they just going to say no, we're not passing anything, we're going to try and screw you Democrats for 4 years or 2 years until the next kind of cycle happens in the Senate? We just don't know. So I think much more interesting for me is what happens in the Senate, and it's definitely closer. Yeah, I mean, and so in terms of like how people can trade all this, again, anyone that has a surefire way of making money in the next 3 months is probably a little bit deluded. If the way I've thought of it is just more probability. So like if you get either a stimulus now that's big, say 2 trillion plus, or you get a sweep of either Republicans or Democrats, because if either of them sweep, then they're going to do stuff, right? It's much more likely they do stuff, including stimulus. And then almost certainly you will see the dollar fall, because Europe just can't. People always talk about the DXY, right? The Dixie, but they don't always say it's 60% euro. So really the only thing that matters is US euro in that. That's really the vast majority of it. And so in Europe, they're not going to do more stimulus for a long time. It's just not politically going to happen. So if you have a giant thing in US, that could absolutely devalue the US dollar more, which would be very, very bullish for probably equities, probably gold, probably Bitcoin. It's probably going to be really bad for bonds. And, we've seen that just in the last week. There was, before the first debate, there was a lot of talk that, Biden can't stand up to Trump. He's going to say stupid stuff. He's going to, people he's saying, he's going to stop talking in the middle of a sentence and whatever. But he didn't. He was fine. I mean, it was a complete crapshoot, the debate. I somehow managed to watch it and was just like, well, there's only one loser here, which is kind of politics, but or America, I guess one could argue, but
the entire world.
Yeah, but that's true, unfortunately. Yeah. But before the debate, because everyone was convinced, not everyone, but a lot of people, and you've again got to remember that Twitter polls are not polls; they're completely massively biased. So the average Twitter poll right now is 2-1 that Trump will win the election. You just look at any big poll, and it's generally about that. Now, of course, it's not if it's from the Democratic Party. You've got to see who's done the poll, but and why? It's because on FinTwit, a lot of people are financial people, and they lean more Republican because they have, on average, more money and they want to pay lower taxes. It's kind of simple. Interestingly, the betting markets are kind of in the middle. They're like 60% Biden right now. But the actual polls are more like 80% Biden right now. So Twitter's saying 66% Trump, and the polls are saying 20% Trump. Well, I looked at that and thought that's a really interesting discontinuity. And so I thought, to be contrarian, my view was I think Biden's going to do much better than people think in the debate. So I basically sold a bunch of like longer duration treasuries and like options in that, thinking I can buy them back at a better price, because if Biden seems to be doing fine in the debate, people are going to think it's more likely the Democrats sweep, and then we're going to get a huge stimulus, and then bond yields are going to go crazy up high, and then the Fed will come in and just buy crap tons, and yields will come down again. But the ultimate loser there will be the currency. Something actually has to always. So far, we're up 20 basis points since then. 30-year yields were 1.4, now they're 1.6. So that's kind of been playing out. Except now, of course, people are thinking there might be stimulus now, which again may or may not happen. But the point is like, whilst I was saying I was like roughly 25% gold, 25% Bitcoin, which generally are going to do well when the dollar goes down. I still have, even though I sold some, a good allocation to long duration treasuries, which will do well when the dollar goes up, generally, but not always. So someone told me once, a wise man, like, if you're looking at your portfolio and everything's gone up in a day, don't think you're smart, because that means there will be days where everything goes down.
Yeah.
And this has happened recently, right? There were times where everything, because bonds and equities are meant to have a negative correlation. They don't always, and they absolutely didn't in 2019. But like, there were times a few months ago where gold was up, bonds were up, equities were up. The only thing that would have gone down would be the dollar. Bitcoin was up, like everything, commodities were up. And but equally, what happened a month or 6 weeks ago, you had days where the exact opposite happened, where everything went down. So you actually want to have things going up and down in your portfolio each day, because it shows you actually do have some hedges in it. And at the end of the day, it's a long run game. You want to compound this stuff every year. Although, look, if you're young and don't have a family to support and love something like Bitcoin, go for it. I mean, that's in effect what I did years ago, and I don't have any problem with that either.
Sure. Yeah, the time preference in investing is really important, and taking the emotions out of where you're putting your money is a huge skill set. That's something I really appreciate about Bitcoin Twitter, because when the price goes down, well, I think there's good people to follow and bad people to follow, and the bad people to follow are the people that are, the price moves 2%, and they're posting, oh, it's going down to 5K, or and then it goes up 2%. They're posting, oh, it's going to hit an all-time high in 30 days, and those are probably the worst people to get investment strategies from. But the people that I love are the ones that are posting screenshots of their ridiculous buyout orders the days that it goes down, because that's just and that's one of the things I was interested in your interview with Raul was that's one of the things he's talking about is a lot of times to win big on these investments, you have to really hold on during tough times. And the example that I hear probably the most is with Amazon.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Having gone up and down, potentially 90%, and, people saying that it's a stupid company and that they don't make any money, but had you have held that investment for a long time and seen the potential of where it was going to go, you want to win big. But yeah, the idea of hedging is also really interesting. It's something I used to do more, but the way that I look at it now is like, I like the certainty of knowing that fiat currencies are just going to fail. They're going to go to zero. That's just what I believe. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any way out, unless they were going to start practicing sound money principles, which is impossible based on the way that our economies are built. So
it's a time scale though, right? Is that happening tomorrow? Probably not. Is it happening in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? I don't know. I mean, when the world reserve currencies change, it's a process. So like the last time it changed was really pre-World War One. It was the pound. I mean, it really was. And then World War One, things started to change a bit throughout the 25-year period to World War Two. And then after World War Two, it was basically obviously the dollar. But it was a process. It took time. It wasn't just like one day everything changed. But like Raul was saying, like, I mean, okay, so crypto Twitter is a good one, right? So there's a lot of noise. And at the end of the day, if you believe in Bitcoin, for whatever reason, and there are many reasons to believe in it, then just who cares? Like if it goes down or up 2% in a day. And by the way, I remember the days where it was going down 50% in a day. I wasn't involved and it was going down 80% in a day or 90%, which did happen in like 11, 12, right? Or up. So, but I absolutely remember the days when it was, 40, 50% in a day, sure. Now it went up sometimes that too. But it's so hard not to get emotional. One way I found to do it is just to force yourself to like, it's like, if it gets to this number, I'm selling some, or if it gets to this number, I'm buying some, whatever the asset might be. And then you write it down and you just do it. And you do it without thinking, because the point is you're just trying to take emotion out of it. But I think it's probably the hardest thing in investing. Like, how many people bought Bitcoin at $1 and held it? I mean,
very few. Yeah,
it's stupid to do that too. You could argue, because if you've done a 10,000x on something, then you probably want to diversify. But it just does depend on your stage of life, what you're trying to achieve. If you really want to accumulate, then you've got to take risks. But as Raul's point, which I think is a good one, is like, look, either own your own house or own enough money that means you can just be okay for a period of time. Now, if you're 22, you might want to have 3 months of money, 6 months, because I can go and get some job anyway, I'll be fine. If you have a family with kids, well, you're probably going to want several years of money, because it's just a different mindset. If you're 65 and literally retiring, well, you're probably not particularly smart putting 100% into Bitcoin, which might halve the next week. So that's why people ask me all the time about portfolio allocations and recommendations, and I'm always just like, look, I'm happy to say what I do, but like everyone's got a completely different situation. And again, never, like someone like Raul, like he will explain his thought process, but he's not going to say you should therefore buy this and not that. Like it's in these exact amounts. It's different every time. Everyone has to make their own decisions because everyone's in a unique situation.
Yeah, everybody's risk tolerance is different, and just perspective.
Exactly.
And definitely. And that's one of the things I really appreciate, is listening to people with different perspectives too. And I'm always happy to have people that, like Fed Up Biz Owner, who don't believe in Bitcoin, to come on the podcast, because
I've spoken to him many times about it.
Yeah. But
he kind of doesn't want to. He's kind of funny. He's like, well, I might care one day, but I just don't want to. And I would say to him, well, like, what? Why? I mean, why would you not want to understand something a bit more? It doesn't mean. And I'm like, why don't you just buy $10 worth? Like, have like a few thousand sats of it or whatever, and at least you've then gone through the process to, like, you've had to move money to a Coinbase, you've done whatever, or Kraken or whatever, and as soon as you have something of something, and actually in some ways there's no point having a $10 because it's kind of irrelevant, but like if you have whether a large amount of money is $100, $1,000, $1 million, $1 billion, whatever, like if you have enough that it's like you notice it, but if you lose it, it doesn't matter, then doesn't matter what the asset is, then you'll pay much more attention to it, and you'll probably dig in and learn a lot more about it. So a lot of hedge fund people started in Bitcoin. They just bought a little bit and then just added as they got more comfortable with it.
Yeah, that's why I like Robinhood a lot too, for people getting into equity. Well, hopefully they don't spend too much time on Wall Street bets and getting into margin trading right off the bat. But
unfortunately, that does happen though. So I think they've been a little aggressive in allowing people to trade short-dated options, which are just bets. I mean, let's be very clear. I'm buying Tesla 2-week call option. It's a bet. And yes, you can make 10x and you can lose your money, and you're overwhelmingly likely to lose your money. But that happened. That's what really took the market by surprise. Like anyone that said this in March is lying. Like, sorry, unless you can prove to me they said it in March. But anyone that's trying to claim they said this in March, which was ultimately the tail started wagging the dog. So all these, because when you buy an option, it's an option to 100 shares, right? So there's sort of 100x leverage. It's not leverage in the sense of that you can then also lose more than you put in, but like, so the likes of Citadel and other huge market makers who are selling you that option. I mean, those options are being sold generally by market makers. they have to buy the underlying to hedge themselves. And people, there were so many options being bought that it actually started driving the underlying price. And options theory breaks if that happens. I mean, it won a Nobel Prize, Black-Scholes, right? It's been used for decades. But it's that, and along with passive investing, which Mike Green's probably spoken the most eloquently about 50% of flows now are passive. Well, that means it's just machines buying, selling, Apple, Microsoft, whatever. They don't care. They're just doing what the algorithm says. And the number of people actually setting the price, thinking, well, which is the better company right now? That's just been going down and down very consistently for since the mid-70s, since Jack Bogle and Vanguard came up with the first ETFs. So there's a lot of very structural things happening, but the amount of retail like investing that's happened this year took everyone by surprise. And I know now it's easy to say, well, some people got these stimulus checks and they just put $1,200 into some call option. It worked, and so they 10x their money. And before you know it, this is actually like a lot of actually exposure. But back in March, most people saying, well, retail is irrelevant because institutions control all the flows. Like, I mean, I don't know anyone that called that ahead. I know people that said, oh, there's going to be a lot of liquidity, so that's probably good for stocks. Fine. But that was kind of a slightly different point.
Yeah. I don't think anybody saw Davey Day Trader coming out.
I think he's awesome. I
love him.
listen.
Yeah.
I always ask people, have you listened to his stream? And when people try and evade me, I know the answer is they have not. So like, I do not listen to every stream he does, but I have listened to 5 or 6, and I did watch the Scrabble one, and I just so happened to be watching it, and it was just hilarious. And I'm like, this guy is a genius at marketing, and like, and then the Green Hammer came, and like he, I have no idea if he's going to get into a bunch of trouble or not or whatever, but like the fact that everyone's talking about him, and no one cares what Goldman Sachs think. They care what, I mean, you could argue it doesn't matter what Goldman Sachs think, because they're always going to be long, like whatever makes them money. But I think he's a breath of fresh air. I think he's great. I think people that think he's an idiot absolutely do not understand what his point is. He's a marketing genius that's trying to get more attention for himself and Barstool Sports. And yeah. And by the way, anyone that's built a $400 million business and sold it, fair play to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I need to get myself a Green Hammer. That might further the podcast.
I just love, he just takes a meme and goes with it, right? And it's just like, and it seems ridiculous at first, and then you watch it again a month later, and he's still got that bloody thing on his shoulder, and it's I think it's great, and it's actually shaken up the industry. Whether for good or bad, I have no idea, but I think more people that learn about investing is good. But of course, like, some people are going to lose their shirts. So nothing always goes up.
Yeah. Yeah. I liked what Raoul said about building a foundation, and like his suggestion of buying a house and having something to fall back on. I think that's really important. And that's what COVID has really, really exposed, is that people just do not have savings. And it's really problematic. And part of that is just like the way that the money works. If you're going to lose purchasing power over time, it seems counterintuitive to save. And, the typical person in America, at least, when they get a raise at their job, they're going to go and add some more expenses, buy a little nicer car, or move their kid to a nicer daycare, or do something like that, versus put money away in case something happens in the future. And that's super, super problematic. One of my favorite videos is, I think Anthony Pompliano suggested it on one of his podcasts, but How That Economic Machine Works by Ray Dalio. And it's kind of this talk about how, you can't just rely on debt for forever. There's going to inevitably be slowdowns in the economy, and the slowdowns are really, really healthy, I think, for average people, because it puts into perspective of like, oh, I need to save money, and quit buying all this stuff. And that's what 2008 was for a lot of people. And it's interesting to look at charts of like average people's savings going up after 2008. And I think that's what's going to happen here too. But the question is like, where can you put your money that won't just like completely
sure. I mean, so there isn't much yield out there right now.
Yeah.
And to be honest, where there is yield, which let's say yield farming in crypto, like, well, yeah, you could be scammed the next day. So like, that's not in any way going to be a mainstream thing. But yeah, no, I mean, the savings rate did go up a lot in March and is still way elevated to where it normally was. But you're right that, the fact that people need this stimulus package so badly to literally shelter their families and feed themselves shows there's a gigantic problem. It doesn't matter what the stock market's doing. These people have no stocks. So it is like, and, it's exactly the same as the late 30s. Dalio's spoken about that quite a lot. I mean, in effect, what you're getting is you're getting, there's this confluence. So sometimes in macro, like when two things kind of that maybe are or not related, but sort of start lining up, you can have real changes. So Dalio's point on debt cycles was generally that there's a short-term debt cycle, which is say 4 to 7 years, although you could argue now it's 10 to 12 or whatever. Why? Because of the central bank interventions. But you've had ups and downs. But what tends to happen is you get higher lows in and higher highs in the debt to GDP levels every time. But then what happens is over about an 80-year period, roughly 70, 90 years, whatever, at some point that just kind of blows up because it's just got too much. So that happened in effect it's a process again. So in the late 20s, 30s, early 40s, and then you had, that happened. And then people thought it had happened in 2008, 9, but actually we're still in that same debt cycle because we haven't had the reset, which is called deleveraging. At the same time, we're having a human cycle, which has been talked probably best and most famously by Neil Howe, who wrote the book called The Fourth Turning, which he wrote in the late 90s. It even said 2020. It basically predicted around 08, 9, and then around 2020, about 10 years after, there's going to be two like events. But what he was really looking at was generations. And so it's called the fourth turning because there's a first turning, a second, a third, then a fourth. Well, how long's a generation? Well, it's about 20 to 25 years, roughly. Well, multiply that by 4. Okay, you get to 80, 90 years. Oh, that's exactly the same length as the long-term debt cycle. And by the way, the first turning started after World War II. That's just when the debt cycle got reset. So these two frameworks are lining up right now to mean 2020s could be a year where, because basically what happens in the fourth turning is that's pretty much when everyone of differing political views hates each other. It happened in the 30s. They won't talk to each other. If you're a Democrat, I'm Republican. It is not possible for us to talk about, even if it's sunny. We will disagree. Yeah. We will disagree that 1 + 1 = 2. Anything we say, we will disagree on. And every conversation within about 3 seconds will start us slagging each other off and calling each other names. And social media obviously made this much worse. Although, of course, it also gives you bubbles where, I don't use Facebook, but like when I go to my Facebook feed, it would look like the world's fine. Anyway, it's like, as in we all agree, but it's because it's got certain biases, right? And if you look at someone else's, you'll be like, whoa, that's really, that's what people are talking about. So the whole point of all that is that we have these two cycles, the debt cycle, and I call it kind of the human cycle, coming together. And it makes me also very bullish on the future, but I just don't know when in the future. But let's say 2030s or beyond, because what happens is you get through both those cycles, and whether there's debt jubilees or who knows, right? But then you tend to have some political upheaval. Yes, there might be big riots, and there tends to be like some form of either war or revolution. That means people are going to reset the wealth gap to some degree, and it could come from huge taxation. It could, who knows how it happens, but it will take time. But I think one thing that keeps marching on is just technology, as Jeff Booth says most probably eloquently. It just exponentially gets better and better and better. And people now know what exponential growth means because of COVID. doesn't mean 2468. It means 24816 32, and that's not going to slow down. So there's huge opportunities in the future. We've just got to get through this. I think the next few years is about, in effect, surviving as an investor. You might make some good trades here, there, sure, but anyone with an appreciable amount of money, in 10 years from now, like, I doubt many are going to have 5-10x it or whatever, because we're just in a world of zero yield. So it's like, it's very hard to compound this, but there'll be plenty of people who take big bets and lose. Now, maybe having allocation to Bitcoin is an obvious way, to play this game.
Yeah. World of zero yield, soon to be negative. Yeah.
I don't know if the US, we'll see. It doesn't really matter. Like, Europe's already gone negative in Japan, but I don't think Jerome Powell wants to be that guy, but we'll see. He may not have a choice.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know if a lot of people remember this, but I remember the president trying to push him to negative yields or interest rates, and I thought that was pretty mind-boggling, but it's turned out to be one of the lesser mind-boggling things to happen recently. But
sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think that perspective is really good, because so many people right now are stuck in this kind of hopeless spiral of thinking everything is just going to end, and having a long-term time preference is really, really important. And to be able to look back at other major upheavals throughout human history and say, humanity was able to survive this. We might not survive this, but I think there's probably a good chance that we will. And to look forward and say that there could be a better future where extreme wealth inequality is less, and there is peace, and there isn't such tribalistic polarization in society. And it's, as you were talking about that, I was thinking of Germany in the 1920s when the National Socialists were fighting the communists in the streets, and kind of what's happening right now between different groups, whether it's, in Hong Kong or the US or, wherever, just people polarized on either side. And some of the people that have come on the podcast, like the guys from WTF, happened in 1971. We talked about how when times are good economically, people just have better things to do than to go out in the streets and fight each other or protest, because they're, secure. And when that security goes, people start to go crazy. Yeah, I'm pretty bullish on the future too.
In some ways, right, it's really simple. Okay, if the world's going to end, well, we're all fucked anyway. So there's not really much. I mean, literally, if a massive asteroid, okay, it's really simple. Think of it this way. Okay, there's a 100-mile asteroid that is 50% chance if it hits the Earth or not. And it either hits or doesn't. And we don't know. Let's just say. Now, we ultimately would be able to work it out, but whatever. But there's nothing we can do to stop that. It's far too big. It's impossible. It's like Belgium hitting the Earth. Like, you can, there's really nothing we can do about it. We're dead. Okay, sure. Well, it's 50-50. Well, you know what? If it happens, well, you know what? There's nothing we can do about it. Maybe a few people somehow survive underground for a few months and whatever, but ultimately we're dead. Okay, fine. And it misses, well, doesn't matter. It just gets ejected out of the solar system. It's fine. So there's sort of the people who are perpetual doomsayers, I never understand, because it's like, well, humans are they're very ingenious. We do make progress on technology, science, we make progress on cultural aspects generally. Now that can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Science generally is not like that. It tends to just go forwards. There's arguments that maybe, Concorde was ahead of its time. Clearly we went to the moon and haven't been back for a long time. There are some examples of things that there was a bit of a step back, but generally science marches on because it builds. Cultural stuff, not always, right? but generally the world's more inclusive. By the way, there's been far fewer wars than we used to have. I mean, just look at Europe over the last few hundred years. I mean, every 20, 30 years, there was like massive Europe-wide conflicts. And this was when Europe had, a lot of the world's GDP. And since World War II, there's been none. Now, there have been conflicts, of course, but none have been big, global or indeed pan-Europe. So actually, one good thing Trump's done is he's not started any wars. He's the first president for quite a while. You can love him or hate him, but I think that's a simple fact. Now, he hasn't necessarily brought the troops home that he said, but and again, you can get into an endless argument. But there's again in Asia, there haven't been giant wars for a long time. I mean, think back to there's two still wars going on, I guess, theoretically, which is North-South Korea and China-Taiwan. They've never really been resolved, but they're not hot wars. So I just think, what's the point being pessimistic in the long run? There's nothing wrong with saying, I think in the next year or two, there might be some speed bumps. And here's what I'm doing to try and protect myself. And again, if there's, let's say fiat currency is doomed over the next 50 years, let's just make up a number. And it, in effect, becomes a roughly 100-year experiment. Okay, well, that will lead to lots of opportunities too. So I think one has to be, there's no point being overly pessimistic. And generally people that are not successful. There's very few overly pessimistic billionaires out there. So, and, people would say, well, George Soros, whatever. No, I mean, he just absolutely nailed some massive trades that made him famous. But broadly, they're trading all the time. And again, there's very few people that build successful companies or whatever are overly pessimistic. So they're the people I tend to just tune out on Twitter, because I just kind of, if someone's literally made themselves into a meme and every single post they make is the same point, it's the same thing, and it doesn't matter what any data say, they say the same thing. I think they're like the most boring people on Twitter that I just stop following.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the mindset of an entrepreneur and an investor, is somebody that is hopeful, and instead of looking at solely the problems, is looking at the opportunities. And so many people that are stuck in that mindset just won't bear any fruit.
Right? I mean, Raul and I talked about this, but I mean, I've started 5 businesses. Raul started 2 or 3 businesses. Like, I've had success and failure. But America's great in that you can fail and it's not a problem. It could be a real issue in parts of Europe where you're like, and in Asia, you fail in Japan, okay, you get stigmatized, big style. And so they, I mean, China's much more like the US, where it's like, yeah, go for it. It's actually kind of very much kind of it's not a communist country. It's kind of a capitalism mixed with it in this kind of very interesting way. I mean, they learned a lot from what USSR did wrong, where they weren't allowed, in effect, for people to actually build big companies that were important. But I really do believe everyone should. I know Raul kind of took me up on this. Right, I've always thought everyone should start a business, but he's right in that not everyone's got the right mindset to start a business. But I think everyone should at least then work in an early stage business, because you could be the behind the scenes guy that adds the numbers up, or you could be the operations guru. Like the mini Tim Cook, who like actually was the guy that, when Steve Jobs changed the first iPhone from plastic to glass 2 weeks before launch date, Tim Cook made it happen. Well, Steve Jobs had no clue how to make it happen. Tim Cook made it happen. And that was one of the most incredible stories. You could be the person that is the social glue that keeps everyone together, maybe more virtually these days, but or you're the best salesperson, or whatever. But working in an early stage business, i.e. a business with like less than 20 people, where everyone has to just muck in and get shit done, I think is really valuable. I totally get some people hate it, but I think it's a really good learning experience. It'll probably make you know if you want to try and start something or not. And starting a business, like it is really hard. It's probably the hardest thing one ever does. And you're overwhelmingly likely to fail. But that's not being pessimistic. It's just what the numbers are.
Sure.
But what will be sure is you'll learn a crap ton, and you'll almost certainly be way more effective in whatever you do next. And I think much more employable too. I worked at Bain & Company like 15 or so years ago, and in London, and they had a very regimented way that basically they wanted to hire a bunch of people who are identical, pretty much. So I called it like automatons, and they wanted to train you to basically at each level to pretty much have the identical skill sets of everyone else. Now, of course, people were good at different things and whatnot, but the system was really quite designed to make people very similar until you kind of made until you a very, very senior partner, when actually encouraged more to like branch out and think differently, because they just wanted anyone to be replaceable by anyone else like instantly. And it sort of was like a very interesting thing to see. I mean, it's an amazing company, but it kind of drove you kind of if you're more creative, it drove you a bit nuts after 3 years or so. Yeah.
Probably similar to working at Amazon right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I like that. Well, there's definitely tax advantages to starting your own business, even if you're not going to do anything with it. That's the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad talks about that, and it's pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, starting
in the US, so it is not necessarily the case in other countries. So
yeah,
in the UK, it's very little advantage. There used to be, but not so much now. So that's very much dependent on where you are.
Yeah, I mean, starting a business has been one of the greatest experiences I've had. I've just been learning and seeing things from a different perspective, and watching my girlfriend start her business during COVID has been cool as well. There's just it gives you a whole different mindset to be solution oriented, and so many people just aren't. And that's one of the things that's really a bummer right now is, for some reason, people think that showing up to the voting booth, I won't argue whether I have my own opinions on it, but people think that somehow is going to be a problem solving activity, where, going and voting for a politician doesn't determine what's happening in your local communities. It might have some effect, but the entrepreneur they see a problem and present a solution. And that's so much of what we need in Tucson, because we have massive poverty, terrible schools, and just not a lot of opportunity.
Right, but I think that's really important what you said. So I haven't been to Tucson, but I have been to Arizona, like we talked about before, and in November, and it was beautiful. It was just so nice a few years ago. So in the businesses I've started or co-founded or whatever, or executive at, you'd often have these executive days where the other execs will be talking about what are the traits we want to have in this company and whatever. And I always only ever said there's one word I care about, and the word was curiosity. And actually, a lot of people I've started businesses with and run them with agreed with me, and a lot of people in the room were kind of surprised that we thought this was the most important word. But it's, to your point, it's about solution orientation. It's all the same thing. I'm curious to solve this thing. No one else is. So in a big company, it's you think, oh, who can I ask that can solve it for me or tell me this is what we did last time? Well, actually, in a small company, it's no, I have to solve it. And I may know nothing about, it could be, in a tech startup, you're either a developer, i.e. an engineer, or you're not. It's pretty much how it works. And at first, you're going to need a bunch of engineers to build stuff. Now, of course, product's kind of in the middle, but then other people are generally selling or marketing or whatever. I mean, it's kind of what you do. And, so, you might be doing something you've never done before, but those that are curious, and I don't think this is taught that well in schools, anywhere, even in the best, I have no idea what the best state is in the US for schools, but
probably Iowa, but yeah.
Okay. So, right.
Yeah.
So
not important.
Right. But okay, cool. I did not know that. So that's cool. But I know in the UK, it's here are the problems, you just work through the problems. It's a linear thing. And, you've solved the 10th problem. Well, you can stop now. And I was lucky when I was young that I was at a school that said, I was good at maths, sorry. No S on the end. Maths in the UK. And for whatever reason, the teachers, I completed all the maths books when I was 7 that I should have completed when I was like 11 or whatever. And so they just started giving me new stuff, and they just said, we can't really teach you anymore because we don't really know. So just do whatever you want. And they got me a bunch of books that they got from the local kind of the next school for older kids. Just said, do whatever you think is interesting, because you've done whatever we can teach you. And that was awesome, because that taught me, that in effect I could just, negative numbers seem interesting, let's look at that stuff or whatever. And that's why when I did my PhD, like in superconductors, it's the same thing. I think it's not everyone can do a PhD. I completely get that, but it absolutely means, the only person that's going to figure out your stuff is you. And you're trying to do something no one else has done, else you wouldn't be doing it. You can't get a PhD generally you can't get it by just repeating what someone else has done. You generally have to do something new. And whilst your supervisor can help you, it's ultimately up to you to solve it. So I think curiosity is such an important thing. And by the way, like take now, like say in whether it's Tucson or, I don't know the dynamics of Phoenix right now, in terms of, I don't know if there are people moving in or out. New York, San Fran, you've got people moving out, right? Because they don't want to be in big cities. Well, that's going to be huge opportunities. Real estate, to your point earlier, it's not going anywhere. Physically, it's going to be there. And, there's going to be, cities are going to look different in 10 years. And you know what? Someone in their 20s is going to work that out. And maybe they build the WeWork that should have been built. Who knows? Post-COVID WeWork, and WeWork wasn't exactly the world's greatest business, but there's, when there's difficulty, there's always opportunity. And the other thing you said on voting, like so in Australia, you're pretty much forced to vote. It's not, you don't have to, it's kind of a little weird, but they have very, very high turnout. And a lot of people don't like it, because a lot of people say, well, you know what? I just think all the politicians are idiots. You can just you can spoil the paper. So, so I don't believe in forcing people to vote, but I controversially have a view that the ballot box is important. Honestly, the peaceful transition from whichever party to whichever party in Europe, in US, and increasingly in Asia is a huge foundation for the world. And I do believe ultimately things will get solved at the ballot box. And I get that things can go wrong and there can be accusations of wrongdoing and whatever. But that's why I think this election is important. And whoever people want to vote for, I really don't care. But when people say no, but it's all just a deep state and everything's, I'm like, it's not. Like over long periods of time, like these things will get things solved. So if, for example, digital currencies come and the Fed or whoever know absolutely everything you do, because they basically ban cash, people will work out one day, oh shit, I really don't like that. That's 1984. George Orwell wrote about this. Now, we've already worked this out because we're kind of ahead of the curve. We know where it's going. And COVID just accelerates it, because you see it in Asia. Cash is dirty. I don't want your cash. Governments love this. Mm-hmm. It's not in any way governments pushing this. It's just happened organically. So they love it. But again, if people realize that, now at first maybe people are like, oh, I'm getting free money into that account, so I like all this. But then a few years go past and things go in cycles and waves, and people will work it out. I don't believe we're just going to be in a world where, in effect, everyone's either employed by the government or paid by the government. It has to be private innovation, even though it doesn't always feel like that. So.
Yeah. Huh. The idea of a cashless society, it's pretty much already here, and it's going to be very, very strange and interesting to watch that transition happen over the next a couple of years, even more so. There was a lot in there that you just shared. Trying to unpack it.
That's right. There's a lot going on. So, but look, to sum it up, I don't know what viewers are going to want to hear, but there's, whether you love or hate politics, the 3rd of November does matter. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world. It does matter. If you're interested in macro, it matters, period. Anyone that argues differently is deluded. Now, you can decide to some people I know are just like, you know what? I'm just going to go basically 100% cash and just wait. Not many people think this, but there are some people, or just short-term treasuries, 3-month treasuries, which are in effect cash, right? They're the same thing, basically the same thing. The amount they can go up and down is literally minuscule. So, and so that's one thing some are doing. So like, well, I just want to see what the hell happens, and then you know what, something's going to have got cheap, and I'm going to buy the cheap thing after. Because at the end of the day, when you invest, you want to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they've gone up, which is the easiest thing to do and the hardest thing. Easiest thing to say, the hardest thing to do, because of emotion, like we talked about earlier. I'm more of the view that, well, I don't really want to hold too much allocation to cash for too long, just because actually this whole fiat, slow debasement of fiat. So I've gone more just like to be fairly hedged across all these different asset classes and just see what happens. And then thinking, well, you know what, some will go up, some will go down, but I will live to fight another day, whatever happens.
Sure.
And I'm not using this. Some people will be like, you know what, this is exactly the moment to make some big bets. Which is, for example, what I did before COVID, in like January, Feb, because in Hong Kong, it was fairly obvious to work out. We got different media here, right? And we were hearing stuff from China, and it wasn't that hard to work out, especially when it spread to Iran and Italy, that this thing was going to go everywhere. Because I know people in Wuhan, I spoke to them, so that was a really interesting time where people in Asia had an advantage because they sort of knew this thing was going to go across the world. And at the time, the most obvious thing that would happen immediately was rates would be cut to zero in US. So that was kind of an obvious trade to make back then. Right now, the kind of equivalent obvious trade to me is like probably it's probably the precious metal Bitcoin type thing, in terms of like, if you believe there's going to be just tons of stimulus, but it's not as clear cut because, as we said, if the Republicans win the Senate, or indeed if it's Trump wins Republican Senate, Democrat House, which is the same as now, then maybe there's no stimulus. So it doesn't seem as much as a slam dunk right now. And if there is huge stimulus, certain stocks will absolutely fly. But Tesla can't be worth infinite dollars. I mean, they actually have to build cars, make profit, and prove they can make these better batteries and do all this stuff. Doesn't mean it can't hit 5,000, 10,000. Well, sorry, no. Now they've done the split, like whatever, but maybe probably still can. But
yeah,
who knows, right? But I'm never going to say, "Oh, I'm going to put 80% of my money into that," because it doesn't. That seems kind of crazy. And we might have a very, very weird. People are used to the election being the result known. You basically wake up the next day and it's known. It's the same in Europe. It's quickly counted. I mean, everyone, AP has called everything and blah blah blah. Well, as you can probably see, I watched a bit of mainstream media here in the US just to kind of, sort of just to make me laugh because it's kind of funny. But and I watched both sides of it, right? If you watch a bit of Fox, then a bit of MSNBC, it's kind of pretty hilarious. But it is interesting that a lot of people are trying to educate the American public that's like, well, actually, it's pretty likely that it's not going to be known who wins, unless, to your point, there's a really big, sweep. But if anyone's going to sweep on election day, it would be Trump, because obviously the Democrats have got way more mail-in voting. But although, of course, in many states, the mail-in voting can be counted before. In some states, it can't be counted until election day. So you have these crazy things. And of course, the more swing states, Florida's, North Carolina's, Arizona. Well, I'm not sure about Arizona, but a lot of the more swing states, you've got the more kind of crazy rules. It's just going to take more time to get the result. That period could be very, very, very dangerous in many ways from a civil standpoint, because both sides are going to be convinced they've won. That could be riots that make what happened over the last few months look like nothing. Have no clue what the markets will be doing. Who knows? But in that situation, you just got to hope, and you really got to hope it doesn't come down to like a partisan Supreme Court. Although I do believe they would, if it came down to, I don't believe a Republican stacked Supreme Court, which it will be. I mean, it will be 6-3 or sort of 5.5, 3.5 because of Roberts. But even Gorsuch and Kavanaugh are seem to be people who, you know what? I don't think they're going to vote against democracy, because if they do, the Supreme Court's toast the next time. Let's say they put Trump in when it was pretty clear he didn't win, which is a possible scenario. I mean, it's one of the reasons they want to get Comey Barrett on it now. Maybe it happens, but the 2000 decision was, it was incredibly tight. It was totally crazy how close it was. But if it was just blatantly obvious Biden won, and then there's some weird Supreme Court thing that goes against democracy, the Supreme Court's done. And also Congress may ignore them. They'll say they don't actually have any power, the Supreme Court. Really, they can, as someone said to me the other day, they can put a judgment out on a PDF and people adhere to it, but they don't have to. And there have been times in the past where they did not. So I'm not buying the conspiracy theory that that some weird deep state thing's going to actually change the result of the election. But if it's incredibly close, sure, like 2000, then yeah, it could be important. But anyway, no one's talking about the Supreme Court anymore. So that was last week, right?
Yeah. On to the next thing. It's president has
It's
COVID.
totally crazy.
Yeah, my brother was
next week. Who knows what it will be? So
yeah, my brother had to flee Bolivia because he was living down there when their whole election debacle happened with Evo Morales. So I think that was an interesting perspective on what could potentially happen over here. But yeah, going back to your point, I think one of the most important things to have during this time is just that attitude of curiosity and a sense of purpose and meaning. One of my favorite books I've ever read that I read pretty frequently, almost yearly, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Okay.
And are you familiar with it?
I have not read that book yet.
Yeah,
I'll check it out.
So he was a psychologist that went through the Holocaust and survived it. And through his experience of surviving that, he ended up writing this book and developing this whole branch of psychology called, what's it called? Logotherapy or something like that. But that was one of the things that he talked about pretty adamantly in the book, is that we need to have a sense of meaning and purpose. And if we have that, we can bear any sort of pain or confusion or overwhelming things that come our way. And I think one of the reasons why I started a podcast was I just felt like it's one of the most useful tools out there to get really interesting, really good perspectives from very smart people and present it to people in a way that they can consume it pretty easily, because especially in the city that I live in, because a lot of people just struggle with reading and listening to audio, and breaking it down into small bits can be really helpful for them. But yeah, I mean, it's refreshing hearing your optimistic attitude, especially living in a city that's been so chaotic for so long.
Right, but it's also much less chaotic than. Right, I mean, I haven't spoken for probably a month or two with friends here about. I mean, there are no protests as far. I mean, now of course someone will say, "Well, because they're all being shut down immediately or whatever." But it's honestly, most of the people here were not happy with the protest. They're this is really screwing up Hong Kong. And this was pre-COVID. So remember, Hong Kong was having minus 35% year-on-year retail sales this time last year. And now they've had an extra minus 35% on top of the previous minus 35%, which gets you to minus 60 or whatever. I mean, it's recovering a bit now, but it was, it's a city that needs to be kind of open and, cosmopolitan and tourists coming in, and it's a constant flow of people. That's what makes Hong Kong Hong Kong. And that definitely slowed down. So no question, the last years have been difficult. I mean, no one's trying to say it's been easy, but I also think on stuff like Bitcoin, so for example, when I say be curious, it's so someone says oh well, China can just do a 51% attack on it. I'm okay, really? Can they? Explain to me how. And then 19 out of 20 people you say that to will look at you and they have absolutely no idea beyond, oh, well, don't they just hold a miners? I'm like, okay, please explain to me what happens next. When, by the way, 10,000 Twitter bots immediately say there's a block that's wrong. And everyone in the rest of the world is all of a sudden going to like, whilst there's not a written down plan, there are thousands of people who are going to immediately start working to resolve this. And I bet you within a few hours or even days it gets, and there might be a few, Bitcoin might have a problem for a day or two, but then it will get resolved and they'll ignore these blocks and whatever. Because, and again, you'd say, well, that's not fully decentralized. Well, actually it is, because there's no one actually orchestrating it. It's just like, I don't think China would ever do that, because they actually know now that the threat they might is much more important than if they try and then it will fail. Because then they have no threat. So I think they're incredibly smart and they will not try that. So I'm not worried at all about the fact there's roughly 60% of hash power in China, but give it a few years. I mean, that will change anyway, and it will be far below. It used to be a much even higher number. But again, just being a little bit more curious versus just, the mainstream media thing is, that can just happen. And then no journalist really ever writes about, well, what would really happen under this, the scenes, or, I think the one most obvious attack vector is if, and I don't think this would happen, but if governments really coordinated and stopped fiat to crypto, like if you were not allowed to move money onto Coinbase in US dollars, and all governments at the same time did clamp down on this in a very coordinated manner, that's probably the weakest point right now. Why? Because it's when it actually interacts with the current system. Now, when will all governments in the world agree to do anything? Well, literally never. So I don't think that will happen. But but again, I don't just dismiss it, because you want to. There have been times that but then you dig into it and it's like, well, okay, well, say US did that. Well, what, somewhere like Switzerland or parts of Europe or whatever are like, no, we're fine with it. So you come here, and the people are going to always, countries will, and especially some slightly smaller countries, be like, oh, this is our chance to kind of go up in the world. We can get a leg up on some of the big slow guys. And also just look at places like India. They theoretically sort of banned a bunch of crypto trading, but the Supreme Court actually struck it down recently, and now they're trying to do another thing, and it's just like, it's it just, I don't overly worry about stuff like that, but I do kind of try and play the war games out in your mind about what what can happen. Also, I don't think any of this is going to happen unless it was a vastly larger asset class anyway. I mean, in $200 billion, do you really think anyone cares? I mean, the Fed printed that in one day, by the way, back in March. One day. Peak day was about that. So no one cares. Now, don't get me wrong, if it's 20 trillion, people might care.
And it's not, even if they did make it illegal, there's really, that's what separates Bitcoin from a lot of other things is, you just can't, nobody can shut it down, or at least from what we know. Yeah.
But what's interesting is, say you make it illegal, then okay, so who's going to care more, old people or young people? Well, young people are going to be more annoyed about that because they own more. I mean, no one knows exactly who owns what, right? But every survey shows that people in the 20s own more than people in the 30s, more than the 40s, more than people in the 50s, and people over 60 own very little as a percent of their net worth. And so ultimately you're going to start annoying, and let's just say it keeps just getting more adoption. There's also a point where it gets adoption and people care about it enough, young people that, and by the way, that will vote based on this matter. Like, my dad doesn't care if Bitcoin's allowed or banned. He doesn't care. But again, if governments, and again, it doesn't have to be in US, it could be that Europe says, well, actually, no, we're not going to do that. It's actually allowed here and we want innovation. But the Gen Z and millennials are going to be the largest voting groups as boomers start to, in effect, die off, which is a morbid thing to say, but the average boomer is 65. That means some boomers are 70, or older, and that is going to happen. And politicians are amazing. Generally, politicians in the West are amazing at changing their mind on a dime when public opinion suddenly changes. I mean, they're incredibly guilty of that.
Yep.
So I'm not too worried about that, and I don't worry about in some ways, there could be a technical issue. It's possible, like just a real bug in the code. That can always happen in code. Now, there's a lot of the reason Bitcoin doesn't innovate that fast, you could argue, is because they're really, really sure that the code's not going to lead to bugs. But when there's future soft forks, hard forks, whatever, there are absolutely moments where things can go wrong. But it's been really solid on that so far. And that's where having hundreds of people but again, the number of people that actually can upload new changes to the Bitcoin code is not a massive number of people. It's not hundreds of people. It's a smaller number. So it's the other way of looking at it is what's so it's got some things that could go wrong with it, but then it's got so much stuff going right for it. Everything gets digitized in our world, so why the hell wouldn't and things get digitized, and ultimately I think when big tech gets broken up, which it will at some point because they're just too powerful, although people have said this about Microsoft for 40 years. I like what Jack Dorsey said the other day in terms of Twitter being a discovery platform, and really what the actual content should just be decentralized, so it's kind of can't be removed in effect. And he said some really interesting stuff. I think it was literally a day or two ago. And that's when people start understanding what decentralization is. Now, of course, there's downsides in that once something's uploaded, you can't get rid of it, and it might be a bad thing. So,
yeah.
But all these things will probably get worked out. But yeah, good to be positive.
Yep. What are
in the long term? Yeah.
Yep. What are some of your favorite resources for learning, or books or podcasts?
Yeah, so I pay for a little bit of research. It's more of people that crunch data, so I don't have to. So Hedgeye I use, which is and again, don't judge Hedgeye by Keith McCullough, the CEO's tweets. I mean, he's putting a tiny portion of stuff there, but I don't know, $30 a month, whatever it is, you can get the Macro Show, which is a daily half an hour, in effect, kind of coaching thing about how to think through the market, and there's other. I subscribe to more than that, but that's very useful. But they're really behind it. There's a huge amount of data, and they've got a team of 50 people crunching this stuff, which I just can't possibly do. So I use that as an input into my thinking. You and others, I listen to a lot of different podcasts. I try and find. I don't want to listen. So when Raul came on my podcast, we both agreed the last thing we should talk about is his current macro view, because he's talked about it 20 other times. So we wanted to have a we sort of took it and turned it on its head a little bit and made it more about, the mentality of if you're swinging, for the fences and to get huge returns in investing. So I try and find people I haven't heard of before. I don't need to listen to, whether it's, it doesn't really matter who it is, but if someone's saying the same thing 10 times, it's not that interesting. So I try and find people I haven't heard of before. And I find a lot of podcasts by just listening to podcasts, and people on the podcast are like, oh, I listened to this podcast. And apparently that's it's very common. Ads in podcasts are basically useless, as in ads that people put in them versus recommendations.
Yep.
And then I find Twitter really, really interesting. So it's FinTwit, you can be a lurker, and that's fine. And it's incredibly easy to work out the roughly 200 accounts that are worth following, because all you have to, it's really not that hard. If you can do that in a week or two if you try. And again, everyone will argue a different 200 accounts, but you don't need to follow 5,000 people. You can pretty much get what you need. But what you've got to make sure is you don't get the whole bias thing. So you have to have people in your feed that you hate their view, or you disagree. And if you block them or mute them, your feed will become its own meme. It will become your bias.
Yep.
That's the hardest thing. And I know in my feed, there's more. I definitely have more people that probably lean towards some stuff. But take inflation deflation right now. I mean, in fact, there's probably more people in my feed that think there'll be more inflation before deflation, even though I think probably the opposite in the very short term, the next few months. I'm not talking about years, and it's probably very different. So that's been interesting. It's too easy to, if you block too many people. I mean, there are people I know like Mark Cahodes who he's had to block like 13,000 people or something because he literally just gets unavoidably trolled by them, and it's just it's just awful. So I kind of get it. And he blocked me once for no reason. And I realized he literally just blocked. He just went through and just blocked a bunch of people. And I emailed him and said, "Hey, I didn't actually do anything." He's like, "Oh, sure, don't worry about it," and unblocked me immediately. But I think most people, like, if people are blocking too many people, they're probably trying to tune out other points of view. And if you're trying to invest, that's really dangerous.
Yeah.
I also think do not listen to anyone. Like, if someone's selling you a service. Okay, so if it's like David Rosenberg at Rosenberg Research, okay, he's selling a service. He's done it for 30 years. I do subscribe to him too. It's a data service, basically. He's going to give you all the data out there. It's called Breakfast with Dave. It's really good. He's not giving you really trade advice. And it's very much like, you know what? If you read that, it comes out every day. You can read it in 10 minutes. You're going to know all the important data that's around. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But like, if you find yourself subscribing to like all these people who are trying to give you magic trade recommendations all the time, and that's their thing, maybe you should ask yourself, why are they doing that? Because if they're so good, shouldn't they be running, either they should be retired before they're 40, or they should be running a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. But they certainly shouldn't be selling you stuff at $29.99 a month to, for them to make whatever up. And this obviously happened in crypto like all the time in like 17, 18. I'm not saying therefore they're all bad. It's just, you just got to find the ones where you actually get real value. And the most important thing is to take all these data points and come up with your own thesis that you believe in, that you can be flexible on, but that fits your life stage, the risks you want to take. No one can tell you what to do. Because what happens is if people are like, oh, well, someone told me to buy this, then suddenly like and then someone does it, then they're like in effect trying to claim no responsibility if it goes wrong. As in, if someone tells me to buy Ethereum and it goes down, and I start blaming that person that told me to buy it, well, no, it's my responsibility. I clicked the button to buy it.
Yeah.
So you've got to remember that it's your responsibility and no one else's. No one's forcing you to make these trades. So reading too much of other people's research, I think, can be bad and can maybe, you've got to come with your own theories. But also, if people can just speak to, I like speaking to on my podcast. Like the reason I got fed up Bizona on was I'd been interacting with him on Twitter, and I think I was the first one he came on, and like because this was back in August the 3rd or something like that, maybe early August, and I like getting people on that are not so well known, that have interesting point of view. Now, of course, you could say someone like Raul, super well known, sure, but I kind of try and balance it between the two. So there are people on there people who are running businesses, for example, like one guy runs a call center business in Atlanta. Well, you know what? His view on PPP and all this stuff was fascinating because he's actually day to day saying, I cannot hire people because the government's paying them more money than I can pay them. So like, I can't staff my call center. It's nuts. So I like, and so whilst you might read about that in the mainstream media sometimes, diving into that for an hour, that was a guy called Sterling Cox. That was, I thought, super interesting. So if people can have the luxury, and the nice thing about having a podcast is, the reason I started mine was the real reason was, there's two reasons. One, I wanted to help people understand some of the craziness that's going on, or at least try and help them. But two, I knew I'd be able to speak to interesting people, and the questions I asked them, by definition, are going to be questions I think are interesting right now. So I'm going to get kind of interesting points of view, which may or may not agree with what I think. And it's kind of a way that in effect cost me nothing to kind of speak to really smart people. So it's, everyone can't just pick up the phone and speak to her all. I get that. But but speaking to people, so if you're in Tucson, try and speak with people. You must know some people outside, or do some networking. It's amazing. If you take an interest in someone, they'll probably speak to you. I mean, sure, you can't do that to like Donald Trump. He's not going to reply on Twitter, but like, do some research on someone you think's interesting and say, hey, I listened to this. It was really fun. Can we have a 10-minute chat? I'd just really like to ask you this. I did that to Lacey Hunt, Dr. Hunt. I just emailed him randomly and he did reply and said, sure, I'll like here's my number, and we had a chat. And it was super helpful. He didn't need to do that, but he's a really good guy. And I emailed him questions that I thought were relatively smart, and he would therefore know I've done a little bit of work on it. And but again, this is about being curious. So sorry, that's a very long-winded answer. So
No, I like it. That's good. Yeah,
speak to people and find data and come up with your own ideas. That's the key thing.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the beautiful things about Twitter is so many people have their DMs open, and if they don't, they'll have like an email you can get on their website. And that's how I found everybody for these interviews. It's just trying to learn. And I really liked what you said about not allowing yourself to get into your little echo chamber and just have confirmation bias. I mean, that's one of the reasons I follow Peter Schiff and, really appreciate dissenting views from what I believe in. I mean, I'm a hardcore libertarian, and I'm in an economics program at a state university, so it's going to be very Keynesian, which is the exact opposite. But but it's an interesting experience. When you interact with different people and different cultures, you get a different perspective, and there's no like real black or white. Some areas there's black or white, just my personal opinion, but create a more rounded viewpoint and learn.
And the other point is if you're in America, please speak to people outside of America. Mm-hmm. Please.
Yep.
It doesn't mean you have to speak to people. Okay, so we're 15 hours apart. Well, that sounds really scary, but it's not really. It's my morning. It's your early evening. It's actually not that difficult. So, but there's always a way. I mean, on Twitter, you might know where someone is or not, but also you've got to remember when you're seeing tweets, it's people who are generally closest to you in time zone, right? I mean, if you're East Coast in New York, let's say, well, it's 12 hours to basically China time. So actually you're going to miss each other a lot. So you're actually just going to miss a lot of the tweets coming from East Asia. Just because they're just not coming at that point in time. So you've actually got to remember that. And because again, as long as the world is roughly a sphere, it's turning, it's going around the sun, we're going to have time zones. And again, it doesn't mean you have to be best buddies with 58 people across Asia or whatever, but just having other points of view. Because I think mainstream media is terrible everywhere in the world. And with just no exception. I mean, it's just awful. And so, you just can't build a worldview based upon what you read. But I agree. I think Twitter is well worth. I mean, I basically really don't use any other social media anymore. I find LinkedIn really hard to use. It's kind of really clunky.
Yeah.
Facebook's just gone, whatever. LinkedIn's just become everyone connects with everyone. I've got 10 billion connections. So I did. I had a look. I subscribed to the the pro product, whatever it's called. I can't remember what it's called. You can get it free for a month or whatever. You can actually get it free for 2 months because if you a little tip for people, you can after 1 month, if you cancel, they say, "Oh, we'll give it to you for another month." So you can actually get 2 months for free. It's $100 a month, so it's worth it.
Yeah.
And I realized that once you get through about 5,000 connections, you are literally connected to everyone on Twitter. Sorry, not Twitter, LinkedIn, are at least a third degree connection. Because I went to my third degree and I had whatever it was, 500 million. And I went to my friend, he had basically the same number within literally a few. It was nuts. And it's and then you look at how many users LinkedIn is, it's the same number. So once you get to a certain amount, you're actually connected enough that you can sort of get to anyone. And then it's sort of, so I never found it massively useful. And I don't know. And I just think Facebook's got a long-term problem. So
Facebook is, it's kind of a toxic environment for sure.
Right. But at least it's
I just think,
go on.
I just think it's the way the algorithm works because a lot of the posts just don't get, I mean, there's a little bit of it, but you're not rewarded based on quality, and people finding it interesting like you are on Twitter or Reddit.
Right. Right. But also, luckily, I mean, honestly, I haven't heard this time 4 years ago, you were hearing about Facebook all the time. in the election, and we're actually not hearing about it. That's a good thing. Like the fact we're not hearing about it. Oh, okay, there might be a bad thing that there's loads of weird stuff happening underground, which is possible too. But I think social media was more in the spotlight 4 years ago than it is now. Or maybe there's just so many other crazy things happening in 2020 that we're just ignoring that type of stuff.
Yeah, you may have spoken too soon. We might hear about Facebook this week.
Oh yeah, it would be like the big thing next week or something. Zuckerberg will ban something. No, he's going to stay well out of it. I'm pretty sure. But
he's done a pretty good job. Yeah.
He's stayed out the limelight recently.
Yeah,
that was
putting his head in the sand. Yeah.
He needed to do that. So, which is also what Bezos has pretty much always done. Like, okay, I get he bought the Washington Post and whatever, but like at the end of the day, he just grinds away and builds the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's really.
Google founders are the same. I mean, Tim Cook's the same. Like, they don't want to be in the limelight, but they're gonna. Yeah, if you extrapolate everything right now, there's going to be 5 companies left in the world, or maybe 6, like 3 American companies, 3 Chinese companies, and that's it. And they're going to do everything. That's not going to happen. So there's going to be at some point there will be some form of backlash, probably led by governments, because it's getting increasingly hard to, if you want to start a company in tech that requires data to be good, it's very hard to compete with the big guys. Really, really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate your perspective on things. Where are some good, other than the podcast, where are some good places for people to follow you?
I mean, I'm basically just Twitter. So I'm at Darky999. My surname is Dark. I'm aware this is not the smartest name to have these days, but I've been called that since I was 5 years old. And yeah, I'm pretty active. My DMs are open. That's how we connected. I tend to, if it's a crazy DM, I ignore it, but anything else I accept and more. So, and I'm not overwhelmed by them, so it's fine. I'm very happy to, and I put a whole bunch of different stuff on. I mean, it tends to be macro stuff, but right now I'm annoying people. I can tell when I put a certain thing on politics up, like literally you lose like 20 followers just like that. It's kind of hilarious. But I think 4 weeks before an election, if you ignoring politics, it's probably not that smart either. So.
Yeah, it's those people's losses. They're just retreating to their echo chambers.
Right, exactly. But you know what? As I said, I do not care if Trump or Biden wins. But let's say Biden wins, at least we don't have to have this daily nauseating, just pumping and just bullshit. Like if we could just go back to the president being a president and there's no way Biden's going to be like constantly tweeting about this stuff. Like, oh, is there a trade deal? Is there not? I mean, it's like, maybe it's a sign of the times, but and by the way, maybe people aren't going to like that because maybe it reduces volatility. I don't know, but it's I think it's gone a bit nuts when one tweet can blow your position up in 2 seconds. And by the way, he could just be lying anyway. So it's driven a lot of people nuts. So.
I think one of the funniest things that could happen is if I would love it if he started pumping the stock market and the SEC went after him. I mean, that wouldn't ever happen, but it would be pretty funny. But yeah, well, thanks for stopping by, Chris. And
I mean, a lot of people are like, "Oh, if he doesn't win, he'll be in jail." It's like I do not think the Democrats are going to go on when you have a transition of power and then you try and put the previous person in jail. I mean, if you went and shot someone, fine, that's different. But for stuff that it's not a good look. I don't think Biden's going to go there. It's a really bad look. Nixon didn't happen. He got that pardon in effect, right? Like it's just not a good look, and it will cause other forms of violence and riots and whatever. I mean, again, if I know he famously said he could shoot someone in New York and get away with it. Now he couldn't get away with that, but when it comes to these, whatever it is with, if it's SEC, it's securities fraud, or if it's with the tax stuff or whatever, I just think it's going to get swept up. Just move on. And then it will be very interesting in that scenario, what the GOP do next. That will be very, very, very interesting, because they have to somehow, if that happens, they have to have a plan for the future. McConnell is not going to run it forever. So, like, is it the Tom Cotton direction, or is it Hannity? Is it right? Is it Hannity? Is it an Obama-esque person who's more in the center and whatever? Who knows, right? We don't know. That will be very, very, because if they get that wrong, they could become irrelevant for a long time, because there's just demographic shifts in America that are happening. The fact that some people are even thinking right now Texas might be in play. Now, I seriously doubt that's going to go Democrat, but the fact that that's even a conversation is kind of pretty shocking. But we will see.
We will see. Well, 2020 is almost over. It'll be interesting to see.
Thank God. Oh my God, imagine if 2021 is worse. I mean, like I say to people, like, when you make a trade, you should be 50-50. It's 50-50 the next day, it will go for or against you. There's just simple math, right? If the trade's market price roughly right, it actually is going to be 50-50 the next day if it goes for or against. Well, is there actually any reason 2021 has to be better than 2020? It might be worse.
No, it might be worse. But either way, there's bright things in the future.
That's all right. It'll be fine. I don't really think it can be worse, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, thanks for stopping by, Chris.
No problem. It's been fun.
I hoped you enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Chris Dark. I really did. Make sure to check out his podcast. Follow him on Twitter. He's a really cool guy and has his DMs open. If you have something legitimate, he will respond, and it'll probably turn into a conversation that really adds value. He's definitely a resource that I will use in the future. And make sure to support the podcast by leaving a review. It really helps to get the stuff I'm doing out there for other people. And if you want to support me and what I'm doing with the podcast, check out my website. You can donate Bitcoin or not. I mean, there's a lot of good resources on there, and I'm updating it regularly. But yeah, thanks for listening.